A small teddy bear lies abandoned on the sidewalk, worn, forgotten, yet holding a story of love and loss. Who left it there? What sorrow does it carry? As we unravel its past, we step into a heartbreaking journey of a mother, a child, and the memories that refuse to fade. Some losses change us forever. But can love ever truly be lost? Watch the full story to uncover the truth behind the teddy bear and the pain it silently holds. The street had once been alive with the sound of a child's laughter. It echoed against the old brick houses, danced through the open windows, and found its way into the hearts of those who passed by. That laughter belonged to Emily, a bright-eyed little girl with wild curls and a heart too big for her tiny body. She had a way of making the world feel softer, lighter, as if sorrow could never touch a place where she existed. Her small hands always clutched a worn-out teddy bear, its fur matted from years of love. The bear had a missing eye, stitched back on by her mother with a different shade of thread, and a slightly lopsided smile that had faded with time. But to Emily, he was perfect. She called him Mr. Whiskers, though no one knew why. He had no whiskers, no special markings, just the simple charm of a toy that had seen the world through a child's eyes. Every morning, Emily would run outside with Mr. Whiskers tucked under one arm, giggling as she skipped along the cracked sidewalk. Her world was small but full, filled with the warmth of the sun on her face, the scent of freshly baked bread from the corner shop, and the comforting weight of her mother's hand in hers. She would stop to wave at Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman who sat on her porch knitting, and greet the mailman with a bright smile that made even his tired face soften. "Good morning, Emily," Mrs. Thompson would say, her voice warm despite the wear of years. "Good morning. Mr. Whiskers says hi too," Emily would reply, holding up the bear as if he could speak for himself. Life felt endless in those moments, simple, untouched by the kind of pain that lurks in the shadows, waiting to strike. Her mother, Claire, often watched from the window, smiling as she sipped her morning coffee. She never wanted to interrupt those carefree moments. The world had been unkind to her in many ways, but seeing Emily's happiness made everything feel worthwhile. She worked hard, sometimes too hard, just to make sure her daughter never had to know the kind of struggle she had faced. Emily's laughter was her favorite sound, the proof that she had done something right in this life. Then there were the days when Emily would fall asleep curled up on the couch, Mr. Whiskers clutched tightly against her chest. Claire would run her fingers through her daughter's curls, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. The house was quiet then, but it was a peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that made a home feel full rather than empty. But life is cruel. It never warns you when happiness is about to slip through your fingers like sand. No one knew that one day, the laughter would stop. No one could have guessed that the echoes of Emily's joy would become ghosts, haunting the street that had once been her playground. And no one, not even Claire, could have prepared for the silence that would follow. The teddy bear sat motionless on the neatly made bed, its single remaining eye staring blankly ahead. It had been weeks since small hands had clutched it tightly, since a warm little body had curled around it in sleep. The house, once filled with laughter and tiny footsteps running across the wooden floor, now felt hollow, a place where silence had settled like dust, untouched and unmoving. Mr. Whiskers had been Emily's most trusted companion. He had been there for her first scraped knee, for the nights when thunderstorms shook the windows, for the whispered secrets only a child could share with a stuffed friend. Now he sat alone, his soft body absorbing the cold air of an empty room. Claire hadn't moved him. She couldn't. Each time she stepped into Emily's bedroom, she felt her breath catch in her throat. The pink curtains still fluttered slightly whenever the wind crept through the cracks in the window. The tiny shoes remained lined up against the wall, waiting for feet that would never slip into them again. The bed was still made exactly as Emily had left it that morning, her favorite blanket folded neatly, her pillows slightly askew, as if she had just gotten up to run downstairs for breakfast. And there, in the center of it all, was Mr. Whiskers. Claire sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers trembling as she reached for the teddy bear. The fabric was worn, the stitches fraying in places where Emily had hugged him too tightly. She brought it to her face, inhaling deeply, searching for the faintest trace of her daughter's scent. But time had already begun its cruel work. Each day, The smell of Emily faded a little more, slipping away like a memory she couldn't hold on to. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She had cried so much already, until her body ached, until her throat was raw, until she thought she could never cry again. And yet, the grief remained, pressing down on her chest like a weight she couldn't lift. The teddy bear had seen everything. It had been there when Emily's laughter filled the house, when her tiny arms squeezed him tightly before bedtime. And it had been there on that fateful afternoon, clutched in her hands as she ran down the sidewalk, unaware of what was coming. Claire squeezed the bear, pressing it against her chest as if it could somehow bring her daughter back. She whispered, her voice barely above a breath, "She loved you so much." But Mr. Whiskers said nothing. He only watched, just like he had that day, just like he would for the rest of time. The room felt colder now. Claire stood at the doorway, her fingers gripping the frame so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She had been avoiding this place for days, maybe even weeks. She wasn't sure anymore. Time had become a blur, each day bleeding into the next, an endless stretch of pain and longing. But today, something pulled her toward the room, toward the memories that lingered like ghosts in the air. She took a hesitant step inside, her breath hitching in her throat. The scent of lavender still clung to the air, the faintest trace of Emily's favorite bedtime lotion. It was a cruel reminder, a painful echo of a life that had been so full, so bright, now reduced to silence. Her eyes fell on the small bed, still perfectly made. The stuffed animals were arranged along the headboard, just as Emily had left them. Mr. Whiskers lay in the center waiting. Claire's legs gave out, and she sank onto the bed, burying her face in the teddy bear's worn fur. A sob broke free from her chest, raw and aching. She had spent so many nights sitting here, stroking Emily's curls, whispering lullabies until her little girl drifted into dreams. Now the bed was too big, too empty. Her fingers traced the tiny indents on the pillow where Emily's head had once rested. She had always slept curled up in the same position, hugging Mr. Whiskers close to her chest. Every morning, Claire would wake up to find the bear on the floor, tossed aside in sleep, only for Emily to scoop him back up the moment she opened her eyes. The mornings had been the best. "Mommy, I had a dream," Emily would say, her voice full of excitement as she sat up, her curls a mess, her eyes still heavy with sleep. "Oh, tell me about it," Claire would reply, pulling the covers up around her daughter's shoulders. And Emily would talk about adventures in candy kingdoms, about flying through the sky with Mr. Whiskers, about meeting talking animals in magical forests. But now there were no more stories. No more sleepy giggles. No more tiny arms wrapping around her neck in a warm morning hug. Claire pressed the bear against her face, willing herself to hold on to the past, to remember the way Emily's voice had sounded, the way her laughter had felt like sunshine spilling into every corner of this house. But grief was cruel. It stole memories when she needed them most. Some nights, Claire would close her eyes, desperate to hear Emily's voice again, to replay a single moment in perfect clarity. But it was slipping away. The sound of her laughter was becoming distant, like a song she had once known by heart but could no longer hum with certainty. Her hands trembled as she reached for the small bookshelf in the corner of the room. The books were still there, Emily's favorites. Goodnight Moon, Where the Wild Things Are, The Velveteen Rabbit. Claire pulled one out, flipping through the pages with unsteady hands. She could still remember the way Emily would curl up beside her, pointing at the pictures, making up her own silly versions of the story. "Mommy, what if the bunny could fly?" she had once asked, giggling. "Then he'd have the best adventure ever," Claire had replied. Now, the books sat untouched, collecting dust, just like everything else. Her gaze drifted toward the closet, where Emily's tiny clothes still hung in neat rows. She couldn't bring herself to pack them away. The thought of boxing up her daughter's life, of sealing it inside cold, cardboard containers, felt like a second loss. As if by doing so, she would be admitting that Emily was never coming back. She wasn't ready for that. She didn't think she ever would be. A deep, shuddering breath escaped her lips as she rose to her feet, holding Mr. Whiskers close. She glanced around the room one last time, as if expecting to see Emily sitting on the floor, playing with her dolls, humming a tune under her breath. But the room remained empty. Silent. Claire stepped back, her heart aching with the weight of memories too painful to carry, yet impossible to set down. She reached for the door, hesitating for a moment before gently pulling it shut. She stood there for a long time, forehead resting against the wood, tears slipping down her cheeks. The world outside continued as if nothing had changed. But inside this house, inside this heart, nothing would ever be the same again. It had been an ordinary afternoon. The kind of day that no one would think twice about, the sun shining just enough to warm the breeze, the sound of children's laughter echoing through the neighborhood, the scent of fresh-cut grass in the air. The world had felt normal. Safe. Claire could still picture Emily, her tiny hands clutching Mr. Whiskers as she bounced excitedly near the front door. "Mommy, can I go outside?" "Please," she had begged, her bright eyes full of the kind of joy that only a child could feel. Claire had smiled, running a hand through her daughter's golden curls. "Just for a little while, sweetheart. Stay on the sidewalk, okay?" Emily had nodded eagerly, hugging her teddy bear to her chest. "I promise." And just like that, she had been out the door, her giggles trailing behind her like a melody. Claire hadn't known. She hadn't known that this was the last time she would hear that laughter, the last time she would see her daughter's tiny legs skipping happily down the walkway. She hadn't known that, within minutes, her world would come crashing down in the most devastating way imaginable. She had been washing dishes when she heard the sound. A screech. A crash. The kind of noise that made the air feel heavy, like the world itself had stopped breathing. Then silence. Claire's heart had pounded as she rushed to the window, her hands still wet with soap and water. At first, she couldn't process what she was seeing. A car stopped in the middle of the street. A driver frozen in place, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. The front bumper was dented, the hood slightly crumpled. And there, just in front of it, something small. Something too small. Something that shouldn't be there. Claire didn't remember running. One moment, she had been inside, safe in her home, and the next, she was on the sidewalk, her knees hitting the pavement so hard she barely felt the pain. Emily lay there, her tiny body still, her teddy bear just a few feet away, his worn fur stained with dust. "Emily," Claire had whispered, her voice barely a breath. She reached out, her hands trembling as she touched her daughter's cheek. It was still warm, but she wasn't moving. "Emily, baby, look at mommy." No response. Tears blurred Claire's vision as she lifted her daughter into her arms, cradling her as if she could somehow undo what had just happened. "Please," she choked out. "Please wake up, sweetheart." Footsteps. Voices. The distant wail of a siren. Someone was talking to her, telling her to let go, to put Emily down, to let the paramedics take over. But how could she? How could she let go of the most precious thing in her world? A stranger knelt beside her, gently prying Emily from her grasp. Claire wanted to scream, to fight, to hold on tighter. But her body refused to move. The ambulance doors closed. The sirens wailed again. And then she was alone. Claire didn't remember how she got to the hospital. She didn't remember walking through the sterile hallways, didn't remember the whispers of doctors and nurses around her. All she remembered was sitting in a cold, plastic chair, staring at the floor, waiting for someone to tell her that this was all a mistake. That Emily was going to be fine. That she would wake up, that she would open her big, beautiful eyes and reach for Mr. Whiskers, that she would smile and say, "Mommy, I had a bad dream." But when the doctor finally appeared, his face pale, his eyes heavy with sorrow, Claire knew. She knew before he even spoke. "I'm so sorry." 2 words. 2 words that shattered everything. Claire felt her world collapse around her. The walls, the floors, the ceiling, they all blurred into nothingness. A numbness spread through her body, drowning out everything except for the unbearable, suffocating pain that wrapped around her heart and squeezed until she could barely breathe. Emily was gone. Her little girl, the one who had filled every corner of this world with love and laughter, was gone. And Claire was still here. The days that followed were a blur. People came and went, offering condolences, whispering words of comfort that meant nothing. The house, once filled with warmth, now felt cold and empty. Every sound, every movement, reminded her of what had been lost. And the teddy bear. Mr. Whiskers still sat where he had fallen on the sidewalk, waiting. Claire hadn't been able to pick him up. She had seen him every time she stepped outside, his small, worn body lying in the same spot where Emily had dropped him. She couldn't bear to touch him, to move him from the place where her daughter had last held him. Because once she did, once she picked him up, it would mean accepting that Emily wasn't coming back. And Claire wasn't ready for that. She didn't think she ever would be. The days blurred into nights, and the nights into an endless stretch of sorrow. Time became meaningless to Claire. She no longer knew whether it had been days or weeks since the accident, only that the world had continued moving, indifferent to her grief. But on the sidewalk, time had stopped. Mr. Whiskers still lay there, untouched, abandoned in the exact spot where Emily had dropped him. His once soft fur was now matted with dust, his little button eyes staring blankly up at the sky. The rain had come and gone, dampening the bear and then drying it under the harsh afternoon sun. Cars passed by. Neighbors walked past, their gazes flickering briefly toward the forgotten toy before looking away. But no one picked him up. No one dared to. It was as if they all knew that he belonged to someone who would never return. Claire had seen him every single day. Every time she opened the front door, every time she stepped outside to check the mailbox, every time she forced herself to leave the house just to breathe fresh air, he was there, waiting. At first, she had thought about moving him. She had even crouched down once, her fingertips just inches from his worn fabric. But she couldn't do it. She couldn't bring herself to take him inside, to wash him, to place him somewhere safe. Because doing so would mean accepting the truth. And Claire wasn't ready for that. She wasn't ready to accept that Emily wouldn't come running back to scoop him up, pressing him to her chest with that familiar, giggly exclamation of, "There you are, Mr. Whiskers. I thought I lost you." Instead, she let him stay. Let him sit there, waiting for the little girl who would never return. The world moved on around her. Neighbors still carried on with their lives, though Claire noticed the way they spoke in hushed tones when she walked by. Some offered her sympathy with sad, apologetic smiles. Others avoided eye contact altogether, as if her grief were contagious. She didn't care. The only thing she cared about was the unbearable silence in her home. She had never realized just how loud Emily had been until she was gone. The echoes of her laughter had once filled every corner of the house, her tiny footsteps running across the hardwood floors, the way she hummed nonsense songs while drawing, the bedtime stories Claire read every night before tucking her in. Now there was nothing. No laughter. No footsteps. No bedtime stories. Just silence. And the teddy bear, still outside, still waiting. One evening, Claire found herself standing by the window, staring out at the sidewalk. The street lamp's glow cast a faint light over the small, abandoned bear. The sight of it made her chest tighten, an ache so deep it nearly brought her to her knees. She knew she couldn't keep doing this. Couldn't keep pretending that Emily was coming back. But how was she supposed to let go? Claire turned away from the window, pressing a hand against her mouth to stifle the sob that threatened to escape. She had cried so much over the past days, so much that she thought there were no more tears left inside her. And yet, every time she looked at that teddy bear, the pain struck her just as sharply as it had on the first day. She wrapped her arms around herself, sinking onto the couch as exhaustion weighed down on her. Maybe tomorrow she would pick up the bear. Maybe tomorrow she would finally bring him inside. Maybe. But not tonight. Not yet. Morning came, gray and overcast. A slight drizzle misted the pavement, tiny raindrops clinging to Mr. Whiskers' already dusty fur. Claire stood in the doorway, staring down at him, her heart aching. She took a deep breath. And then, finally, she stepped forward. Her fingers trembled as she reached down, brushing over the fabric she had seen her daughter clutch so many times before. The feel of it nearly broke her. But just as she was about to lift him, "Mrs. Thompson?" Claire flinched at the voice. She turned to see her neighbor, Mrs. Richardson, standing a few feet away, holding an umbrella. The older woman hesitated before stepping closer. I just wanted to check in on you," she said gently. "How are you holding up?" Claire forced a nod, though she wasn't sure how to answer that question. How is she holding up? How did anyone hold up after losing their child? Mrs. Richardson followed her gaze to the teddy bear. A sad smile touched her lips. You know, after my husband passed, I held on to his things for years, she murmured. His favorite sweater, his old watch, even his reading glasses. I couldn't bear to put them away. Claire swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the bear. Mrs. Richardson met her eyes. I guess what I'm saying is, you don't have to rush anything. You'll know when you're ready. Claire looked down at the teddy bear once more. Would she ever be ready? She wasn't sure. But as she gently lifted Mr. Whiskers from the sidewalk, pressing him to her chest, she realized one thing. She wasn't ready to let go of Emily. But maybe, just maybe, she was ready to hold on to the love her daughter had left behind. The world had not stopped. People still hurried along the sidewalk, their lives unchanged, their worries trivial in comparison to the storm raging within Claire. Each day, strangers passed by the spot where Mr. Whiskers had once lain, oblivious to the significance of that small, abandoned bear. They walked with purpose, some engrossed in conversations, others staring at their phones, lost in their own worlds. A few had glanced at the teddy bear when it had been there, but none had truly seen it. To them, it was just a forgotten toy, a child's lost possession that would either be picked up or washed away by the rain. None of them knew that it was the last thing Emily had held. None of them knew that it was all Claire had left. Claire had expected the world to grieve with her. When she lost Emily, she had thought, hoped, that life would pause, that the universe would acknowledge her pain. That maybe, just maybe, the sky would weep alongside her. The wind would whisper Emily's name. The birds would cease their songs out of respect for a child gone too soon. But nothing had changed. The sun still rose, bright and indifferent. The mail still arrived. The neighbors still hosted barbecues, still laughed, still carried on as if nothing had happened. And the strangers on the sidewalk, people she had never met, people who would never know Emily's name, continued walking, their lives untouched by the grief that consumed her. It wasn't their fault. They hadn't known. But that didn't make it hurt any less. One afternoon, Claire sat on her porch, staring blankly at the street. Mr. Whiskers was no longer on the sidewalk. She had finally brought him inside, washed him, and placed him on Emily's bed, right where he belonged. But she still found herself watching that spot, as if expecting something, anything, to change. A mother and her young daughter walked past, the little girl skipping happily beside her mother, clutching a stuffed rabbit in her tiny hands. Claire felt her breath hitch. The sight was too familiar. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she forced herself to look away. She had once been that mother. She had once held Emily's small hand, listened to her giggles, answered her endless questions about the world. But now, she was just a woman sitting alone on her porch, watching life move forward without her. Another day, another set of strangers. An elderly man shuffled past, his cane tapping lightly against the pavement. A group of teenagers laughed loudly as they passed, their carefree voices grating against Claire's ears. A delivery driver jogged up to a neighbor's house, dropping off a package before hurrying back to his van. None of them knew. None of them saw her pain. Claire knew she wasn't the first person to lose a child. She knew she wasn't the only person in the world drowning in grief. But at that moment, sitting on her porch, invisible to the world, she had never felt more alone. That night, Claire stood by the window, staring at the street below. She thought about all the people who had walked past Mr. Whiskers. The ones who had barely glanced at him. The ones who had ignored him entirely. And she wondered, how many times had she done the same? How many times had she walked past someone who was grieving, unaware of the weight they carried? How many times had she passed a stranger on the street, not realizing that their heart was breaking just like hers? She had always assumed that pain was visible, that if someone was suffering, the world would know. But now she understood the truth. Grief didn't always scream. Sometimes it sat quietly on a sidewalk, unnoticed by the world. Sometimes it lived in the eyes of a stranger passing by. And sometimes it was a mother standing behind a window, watching life go on without her child. Claire had not spoken much to her neighbors since the accident. In the days following Emily's passing, some had come by with food, their eyes filled with pity, their words carefully chosen. They had meant well, but Claire could barely tolerate their presence. She wasn't angry at them. She wasn't even sure what she felt anymore. It was just that their lives were still whole, while hers had shattered into pieces too small to put back together. So she avoided them. She avoided their sympathetic glances, their hushed whispers when they thought she couldn't hear. She ignored their invitations for coffee, their offers to help, their gentle reminders that she wasn't alone. Because in the deepest part of her heart, she knew, no matter how kind they were, no one could bring Emily back. But then, one afternoon, Mrs. Evans knocked on her door. Mrs. Evans had lived next door for as long as Claire could remember. She was in her late 70s, a widow who spent her mornings tending to her garden and her evenings reading by the window. She had always been kind, always quick to offer a warm smile or a friendly word. Claire hesitated before opening the door. She hadn't spoken to anyone in days, hadn't wanted to. But something about Mrs. Evans standing there, her frail hands clutching something close to her chest, made Claire pause. "I know you don't want visitors, dear," Mrs. Evans said softly. "But I found something, and I thought you might want to see it." She held out a small, worn photograph. Claire took it hesitantly, her breath catching in her throat when she saw what it was. It was Emily, her little girl, standing on the sidewalk in front of their house, her arms wrapped tightly around Mr. Whiskers. Her face was lit up with laughter, her joy frozen in time. Claire's fingers trembled as she traced Emily's smile. "I took it last summer," Mrs. Evans said gently. "I was sitting by the window, and she was playing outside. She looked so happy, and I thought, I should capture that moment." Claire swallowed the lump in her throat, her eyes burning. "She used to talk to me, Mrs. Evans continued, her voice filled with warmth. "Whenever she saw me watering the flowers, she'd run over and tell me all about her day. She loved to talk about her teddy bear. She said he was her best friend." Claire let out a shaky breath. She loved Mr. Whiskers more than anything." Mrs. Evans nodded. "I remember. She used to say he protected her from bad dreams." She smiled sadly. "And she told me something else once. She said she wanted to grow up and become a doctor. Said she wanted to help people, just like her mommy." Claire's heart clenched. She had always known Emily was special. But hearing it from someone else, hearing how much her little girl had touched others, even in the smallest of ways, felt like both a blessing and a curse. A reminder of what had been lost. A reminder of what would never be. That evening, Claire sat in Emily's room, the photograph resting on her lap. She stared at it for hours, memorizing every detail. The way Emily's hair caught the sunlight. The way her tiny fingers clutched Mr. Whiskers. The pure, unfiltered joy in her eyes. She could almost hear Emily's laughter echoing through the walls. But echoes fade. Memories blur. And Claire was terrified that one day, Emily's voice would slip away entirely. So she held onto the photograph as if it were life itself. Because maybe, just maybe, it could keep the echo from fading. The hardest part of grief wasn't the initial wave of loss. It wasn't even the suffocating sadness that followed. It was the quiet moments, the days when the world moved forward, expecting her to do the same. But Claire wasn't ready. She didn't know if she ever would be. Emily's room remained untouched, frozen in time. Her toys were still scattered across the shelves, her tiny shoes neatly lined up by the door. Mr. Whiskers sat on her bed, his button eyes staring back at Claire every time she walked by. Letting go felt impossible. Because if she let go, what was left? Would Emily truly be gone then? Would she fade away completely, just a memory that the world no longer acknowledged? Claire wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Not ever. One morning, Claire found herself standing at Emily's doorway, her fingers gripping the frame. She hadn't stepped inside since the funeral. Her feet felt like lead, her breath unsteady as she took a single step forward, then another, and another. The scent of Emily still lingered, faint but there. A mix of baby powder, vanilla shampoo, and something uniquely hers. Claire closed her eyes, holding on to that scent as tightly as she could, as if it could somehow bring Emily back. But when she opened her eyes, the room was still empty. She sat down on the bed, her hands resting on Mr. Whiskers. "I don't know how to do this, baby," she whispered. The silence was unbearable. She ran her fingers over the teddy bear's worn fur, remembering the way Emily used to hold him, the way she used to whisper secrets into his ear. A tear slipped down Claire's cheek, then another. For the first time in weeks, she let herself cry, not just quiet, hidden tears, but deep, gut-wrenching sobs. She cried for the bedtime stories left unfinished. She cried for the laughter that would never fill this room again. She cried for all the moments that had been stolen from them. And when the sobs finally subsided, she felt empty, lost. But beneath the grief, something else stirred. A whisper of understanding. Emily wouldn't have wanted her to live like this. Emily wouldn't have wanted her mother to spend the rest of her life trapped in pain. She had been light, joy, love. And Claire, she was dishonoring that love by drowning in sorrow. It wasn't about letting go of Emily. It was about letting go of the pain. That night, Claire made a decision. She picked up Mr. Whiskers and held him close one last time. Then, with trembling hands, she carried him outside. The sidewalk where he had once been left behind was empty now, but Claire knelt down anyway. She placed Mr. Whiskers gently on the pavement, brushing her fingers over his soft fur. "Take care of her," she whispered. And then, for the first time in a long time, she stood up and walked away. Not because she was forgetting, but because she was finally ready to remember without breaking. Mr. Whiskers sat on the sidewalk, just as he had on that fateful day. But this time, he wasn't waiting for Emily to come running back to pick him up. She never would. The world moved around him. Children walked past, laughing and playing, their small feet tapping against the pavement. Cars rumbled along the street. The wind tugged at his worn fur, rustling the ribbon around his neck. But no one noticed him. No one stopped. He was just an old teddy bear, forgotten and abandoned. Claire had left him there, and even though she had whispered her final goodbye, the weight of that moment clung to the air. A little girl noticed him first. She was no older than Emily had been. Her tiny hands clutched around her father's fingers as they walked by. Her eyes landed on Mr. Whiskers, and for a moment, she paused. "Daddy, look," she exclaimed, tugging at his arm. "A teddy bear." Her father glanced down, but there was something in his eyes, something that understood the unspoken sorrow in the air. He squeezed his daughter's hand. "Come on, sweetheart," he said gently. "Let's keep walking." The little girl hesitated, staring at Mr. Whiskers for a moment longer. Then, with a small nod, she let her father lead her away. The teddy bear remained, waiting. Hours passed. The sky darkened, the streetlights flickering to life, casting long shadows across the pavement. The wind picked up, carrying a chill through the air. A stranger walked by, a woman, bundled in a thick coat. She spotted Mr. Whiskers and stopped, tilting her head. Something about him made her pause. She bent down, brushing dirt from his fur, her fingers tracing the worn stitches on his arm. He had been loved once. She could feel it. And for reasons she couldn't explain, tears welled up in her eyes. She had lost someone once, too. She didn't know who had left the bear here, didn't know the story behind it. But she felt the weight of its presence, the lingering sorrow it carried. With a deep breath, she picked him up. She wouldn't leave him out here in the cold. He had already been left behind once. That night, Mr. Whiskers found a new home. The woman placed him on a shelf in her small apartment, next to a photograph of a little boy with a dimpled smile. Her son, gone too soon. She ran her fingers over the picture, then over Mr. Whiskers' fur. Somehow, she felt like she had been meant to find him. Like, in some way, he had been waiting for her. And as she turned off the light, she whispered the same words Claire had spoken before she walked away. "Take care of her." But this time, they weren't just for Emily. They were for every child lost too soon. For every parent left behind, trying to find a way to keep going. For a love that never truly fades. Time didn't erase pain. It didn't fix what had been broken. It only taught those left behind how to carry the weight of loss. For Claire, the pain never truly left. It lingered in the quiet moments, when she woke up expecting to hear Emily's footsteps running down the hall, when she set an extra plate at the table before realizing her mistake, when she caught glimpses of mothers holding their daughters' hands, walking down the street. Grief had changed her, but so had love. Love didn't fade, even when the person was gone. It remained in the laughter that once filled their home. It remained in the stories she still whispered at night, even though no one was there to listen. It remained in the teddy bear she had left behind, no longer hers to hold, but never truly lost. Claire visited the sidewalk sometimes. She knew Mr. Whiskers wasn't there anymore, but the spot still felt sacred, like it held a piece of Emily. She wondered where he had gone. Maybe someone had picked him up and given him a new home. Maybe he was sitting in the arms of another child, offering the same comfort he had once given Emily. The thought made her smile. It was the first real smile she had allowed herself in months. For the first time, she understood something she hadn't before. Love wasn't tied to physical things. It wasn't in the toys Emily had left behind or the photos that lined the walls. It was in the way she lived, in the way she remembered, in the way she carried her daughter's light forward, instead of letting it be swallowed by grief. Emily would always be with her, not in the pain of loss, but in the warmth of love that never faded. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Claire stood on the sidewalk where Mr. Whiskers had once sat. She closed her eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over her. And for the first time since that terrible day, she didn't feel alone. Emily was here. She had never left. Claire placed a single white flower on the pavement, her fingers lingering over its petals. "I love you, baby," she whispered. The wind carried her words away, but she knew, somewhere, somehow, Emily had heard them. And that was enough. The years passed, but the ache in Claire's heart never fully disappeared. It softened, becoming something she learned to carry, but it never truly left. Grief had become a quiet companion, always there, always lingering in the corners of her mind. But with time, something else grew alongside it. Acceptance. Not the kind that meant forgetting, because she would never forget, but the kind that allowed her to breathe again, to smile without guilt, to remember Emily without breaking into pieces. She still visited the sidewalk sometimes. It had changed over the years. New cracks in the pavement, new families moving in and out, children playing without knowing what had been lost there. But for Claire, it would always be a sacred place. A place where she had let go of something she thought she could never part with. A place where she had taken her first step toward healing. One evening, as the sky turned golden with the setting sun, Claire stood at the familiar spot once more. She held another teddy bear in her hands. Not Mr. Whiskers, he was gone, off on his own journey. This one was new, soft and warm, its fur untouched by time. And this time, she wasn't leaving it behind. Instead, she carried it down the street to a small building with bright windows and laughter spilling from the doors. A children's home. She walked inside, her heart pounding as she approached the front desk. "I'd like to donate this," she said, her voice steady but soft. The woman behind the desk smiled, taking the teddy bear gently. "That's very kind of you." Claire hesitated, running her fingers over the bear's ears one last time. "It's for someone who needs it. Someone who needs a friend." The woman nodded. "It will go to a good home." Claire exhaled, a weight lifting from her chest. It wasn't Mr. Whiskers, and it wasn't Emily's. But it was love passed forward. And that was enough. As she stepped outside, the wind brushed against her skin, carrying with it something gentle. A warmth. A presence. She closed her eyes and, for the first time in years, she felt at peace. Emily wasn't here, but she was everywhere. In the laughter of the children playing in the distance. In the warmth of the sun touching her face. In the quiet moments. In the echoes of love that time could never erase. Claire took a deep breath, turned away from the sidewalk and walked forward, toward the life that still waited for her. And this time she didn't look back.